South Park has mocked the immigration debate for over 20 years. Most people assume the show just hits both sides equally and calls it satire. But in 2025, the Department of Homeland Security actually used South Park footage to recruit for ICE, the very agency the episode was mocking. In this video, we break down South Park versus immigration crackdowns. South Park, 1997, and the joke that kept coming back. Comedy Central was not expecting a cultural institution. When the network picked up a crude animated series from two young men out of Colorado in 1997, the working assumption on the outside was that it would be a short-lived novelty, something loud, something deliberately offensive, something that might generate controversy for a couple of seasons before fading out. Trey Parker and Matt Stone had started from almost nothing. In 1992, while they were students at the University of Colorado, they used construction paper, glue, and an old 8mm film camera to make a short animated film called Jesus vs. Frosty, which they screened at a student film event that December. The short featured 4 children who looked like rough, unpolished precursors to the characters the whole world would eventually recognize. In 1995, a Fox executive named Brian Graydon saw the film and paid Parker and Stone a small amount to produce a follow-up called Jesus vs. Santa as a video Christmas card he could send to friends. Graydon initially passed it to 80 people. The tape circulated through Hollywood, and someone digitized it and posted it online, making it one of the earliest pieces of video to spread virally on the internet. Fox was the first network Parker and Stone pitched the idea for a series to, but Fox declined, partly because one of its intended characters was a sentient piece of feces. Comedy Central saw the buzz and moved quickly. The show premiered on August 13, 1997, and immediately drew more viewers than the network had anticipated. 4 elementary school boys anchored the whole thing from the beginning. Stan Marsh was the most grounded of the group, usually the first to notice when a situation had escalated beyond reason. Kyle Broflovsky was the earnest moral voice, frequently correct and frequently ignored. Kenny McCormick barely spoke and died violently in almost every early episode, returning the following week without comment or explanation. Eric Cartman was manipulative, deeply self-interested, casually bigoted, and funny in a way that made people uncomfortable with their own laughter in a manner no other animated character had managed quite so consistently. Around them, the adult residents of a small fictional Colorado mountain town stumbled through contemporary American life in ways that exposed the distance between how people presented themselves publicly and what they actually thought privately. Parker and Stone built the show around the premise that everyone was performing, and that the performance usually fell apart under the mildest pressure. Among the adults at South Park Elementary, one character was positioned from the very first episode as the show's recurring vessel for a specific and ugly kind of sentiment. Mr. Garrison, voiced by Trey Parker, was the boys' elementary school teacher and appeared in the pilot that aired in August 1997. He was petty, volatile, and deeply closeted about his sexuality for most of the show's early seasons, though he channeled many of his repressed feelings through a hand puppet called Mr. Hat, which he treated as a separate entity with its own opinions. Mr. Hat served as a useful device for the writers because it allowed Garrison to say things through the puppet that he would nominally deny believing himself. Mr. Hat was described in several early episodes as racist and had documented connections to the Ku Klux Klan as a running gag. Garrison himself was also casually racist, comfortable expressing views that no reasonable adult should express in front of children. He carried his bigotry the way other characters carried bad habits. It was constant, defining, and gave him no real power over anything. Every Christmas, without fail, he made the same proposal at a town meeting. Whatever the specific civic issue under discussion happened to be, Mr. Garrison would raise his hand and offer his single preferred solution: get rid of all the Mexicans. The first version of the gag appeared in the season 1 episode Mr. Hanky the Christmas Pooh, which aired in December 1997. South Park citizens are debating how to handle Christmas celebrations at a public school, and in the middle of the meeting, Garrison puts forward his suggestion. Mayor McDaniels shuts him down immediately, not with outrage or a moral speech, just with the flat, practiced refusal of someone who fully expected this particular person to say exactly this particular thing. Nothing in the structure of the joke suggested it was his first time making the proposal. The whole setup implied a long prior history of the same exchange, the same dismissal, and the meeting moving on without anyone spending more than a moment on it. A later version appeared in season 7's It's Christmas in Canada, and by that point, the repetition had been made explicit. The mayor's response had become a verbal ritual. She said, in effect, that every year he suggested this, and every year the answer was the same: no, naming the pattern that directly changed the texture of the joke. By framing Garrison's nativist impulse as a predictable annual event with a predetermined outcome, the show was characterizing that sentiment as cyclical, futile, and universally dismissed. He wanted it, he said it, he lost. Life in South Park moved on without absorbing a single word of his proposal. Whatever that specific form of bigotry represented out in the real world, inside the show's fictional geography, it had had no traction and no path to anywhere. Structuring the joke this way mattered far beyond the comedy of a single Christmas episode, because it established the show's fundamental approach to nativist sentiment years before immigration became a major focal point. Mr. Garrison was not designed as a villain to be defeated by righteous characters. He was a portrait of a specific American type, the person whose prejudices are deep and genuine, but who lacks the coherence or social standing to act on them in any meaningful way. His xenophobia was framed as a character flaw rather than a genuine threat, the way another character might be framed as quick-tempered or bad at social situations. The people who dismissed him in those meeting scenes were not moral heroes standing against injustice. They were just people who had heard the same tiresome idea often enough that they had developed a quick reflex for getting past it. South Park was not arguing that Garrison's views were harmless. It was describing the social mechanism by which that kind of sentiment gets neutralized in everyday civic life, and finding the comedy in how automatic and complete that neutralization was, even when the sentiment itself never actually went away. American immigration politics during the late 1990s were nowhere near being neutralized. Parker and Stone launched South Park at a moment when the country was in the middle of a serious, divisive, and increasingly bitter argument about borders, labor, and who belonged in the national community. California had passed Proposition 187 in 1994, a ballot measure intended to block undocumented immigrants from accessing public services, including schools and non-emergency healthcare. Federal courts blocked most of it from being enforced, but the political energy behind it was real, and it had reshaped how politicians from both parties talked about the issue. Both parties were maneuvering for position on immigration in Congress throughout the late 1990s, and multiple legislative efforts stalled before reaching a floor vote. The failure to produce a bipartisan solution left the debate exactly where it had been: loud, politically useful for mobilizing voters on both sides, and fundamentally unresolved. Advocacy groups calling for stricter enforcement and those building organized opposition to what they described as dehumanization were both growing, and neither had enough political leverage to move the argument to a conclusion. By 1997, the Clinton administration had already substantially expanded border enforcement through a series of operations that channeled unauthorized crossing attempts into more remote and physically dangerous terrain without actually reducing the total number of people attempting the crossing. Operations along the California and Texas borders pushed traffic away from urban crossing points, funneling movement through deserts where the journey was harder and the death rate was higher. The Border Patrol was growing, deportation numbers were rising, and the communities of undocumented workers already inside the country were living under a different degree of scrutiny than they had faced in previous decades, while still being embedded deeply in the agricultural, construction, hospitality, and domestic labor sectors that American households and businesses depended on daily. Parker and Stone grew up in Colorado and brought to the show a stated political philosophy that shaped how they engaged with all of it. Matt Stone articulated their stance in a line that became one of the most repeated things associated with the series. He said he hated conservatives, but that he really hated liberals. Trey Parker described their approach as that of middle ground guys who found as much material to work with on the left as on the right. The show, in their framing, was not ideological. It was about finding hypocrisy wherever it lived and exposing it with equal discomfort for everyone involved. Nobody would get to use South Park as evidence that their particular side was right, and that position held from the very first season through the decades that followed. Making episodes in under a week gave the show a relationship to current events that most scripted television simply could not replicate. South Park's animation style, modeled on paper cutouts and eventually produced using software that preserved the same flat, crude aesthetic, was chosen partly because it could be executed quickly. Other animated programs required months of development and production before a single episode reached broadcast. South Park could have something on the air responding to a breaking story within a matter of days. Satire has a short shelf life, and Parker and Stone exploited their production pace to stay close enough to events that the parody landed while the audience was still fully engaged with the real thing. That speed would matter enormously once immigration became central to national politics in ways that demanded almost weekly responses. Throughout the late 1990s and into the early 2000s, immigration lived mostly at the edges of the show's satirical frame rather than at its center. Mr. Garrison made his annual proposal and was told no. Other targets received more sustained attention: organized religion, environmentalism, celebrity culture, pharmaceutical companies, race, guns, and the early internet. Immigration was present, but not the subject of a major standalone episode. Garrison's anti-Mexican sentiment was also not the only place race and immigration intersected in those early years. The show touched on these themes obliquely across several episodes, generally depicting immigrant labor as a background feature of the American economy that characters interacted with casually and without much reflection, which was its own kind of observation about how the country functioned. That observation would eventually become explicit, But first came September 11th. What changed the texture of the immigration debate permanently was the 2001 attacks. They folded national security and immigration enforcement into the same policy conversation in ways that proved very difficult to unwind afterward. Within months, Congress began reorganizing large portions of the federal government under a new structure. The Homeland Security Act of 2002 created the Department of Homeland Security, and inside that reorganization, a new agency came into existence in 2003 under President George W. Bush. Immigration and Customs Enforcement was built from components of older agencies and given a mandate that was specifically different from what had come before. Where the Border Patrol's jobs centered on the physical line itself, ICE was designed for interior enforcement. Its purpose was to find undocumented people living inside the country and remove them, not at the border, inside. Unlike the Border Patrol, whose geographic logic was bounded and clear, interior enforcement operated across the entire country without a natural organizing boundary. ICE used anonymous tip lines that allowed members of the public to report neighbors or co-workers they suspected of being undocumented. It conducted large-scale workplace raids on industries known to rely on undocumented labor, arriving at factories and packing plants with enough agents to detain workers before anyone could leave. It built coordination agreements with state and local police departments so that immigration enforcement could happen as an extension of ordinary law enforcement encounters. Together, these mechanisms created something new in the daily texture of immigrant communities across the country. People who had lived in American towns for years, raised children in local schools, held mortgages, and worked steady jobs now faced an agency whose entire purpose was to locate and remove them. Churches ran sanctuary networks. Employers received federal audit notices. Fear extended from the border crossing itself into the living room. South Park was watching this develop, and in 2007, it embedded an immigration subplot into an episode primarily about something else. The season 11 episode D Yikes centered its main story on Mrs. Garrison and a dispute over a lesbian bar. The immigration component was a secondary storyline. While Mrs. Garrison navigated her own situation, the four boys faced a homework assignment they had no interest in completing themselves. Their solution was to hire undocumented Mexican workers to write it for them. Stan, Kyle, Cartman, and Kenny negotiated terms, handed over the assignment, the workers completed it, and the whole arrangement ended without anyone in the episode commenting on or even appearing to notice the workers' legal status. Nobody made a speech. Nobody paused over the ethics. The transaction proceeded the way transactions between American households and undocumented workers proceeded across the country every day, practically, quickly, and in plain view. Positioning it as a side plot rather than the headline event was the specific satirical argument the episode was making. Undocumented workers doing jobs that American residents wanted completed but preferred not to do themselves was so embedded in the everyday economy of the show's America that children could participate in the arrangement without it registering as unusual. ICE had been operating for 4 years by the time D Yikes aired. Workplace raids were a known part of the enforcement landscape, and yet the undocumented workforce was still fully present, still doing the work, still accessible to elementary school students who needed someone to finish their homework. The episode was not taking a side on enforcement policy. It was depicting the gap between the enforcement apparatus and the everyday reality on the ground, and the comedy came from how comfortably wide that gap actually was. Across the mid-2000s, South Park continued holding immigration at the periphery of its satirical world while the political debate around it intensified. President Bush pushed for comprehensive immigration reform during his second term, combining tougher enforcement measures with a pathway to legal status for undocumented people who had been living in the country for years. The effort collapsed in the Senate in 2007 under pressure from Republicans who viewed any legalization component as unacceptable on principle. The failure left both sides more entrenched than before. During the Obama years, record deportation numbers and a second failed attempt at comprehensive reform kept the subject central to national politics. President Obama deported more people in his first term than any previous president, a fact that fractured the coalition that had backed him in 2008. Immigrant advocacy groups who had supported his campaign took to calling him the deporter-in-chief. Republicans accused him of not enforcing the law strictly enough. Both sides had moved from where they started, and neither trusted the other's good faith. In 2004, before all of that later polarization hardened into its current form, before the border wall became a campaign promise, before detention centers became a household phrase, South Park had already sent a portal through the Colorado desert and built an episode around who came through it. What followed from those 22 minutes became the most durable piece of immigration commentary the show ever produced, not because it was the most nuanced, but because it generated a phrase that crossed from the screen into genuine political life and eventually lost its satirical context entirely. A chant designed to make nativist rhetoric sound ridiculous ended up being used, without apparent irony, by the people it was originally mocking. That transformation said something something about the show, about the immigration debate, and about the distance between a joke and the thing it is describing. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That 2004 episode produced the most durable phrase in the show's immigration history. It left the screen, entered real political speech, and somewhere along the way stopped being a joke. Section 2. Goobacks and the phrase that escaped. April 28, 2004 is when the show aired the episode that produced its most durable contribution to the immigration debate, and one of the more unusual things to happen to a piece of political satire in modern American television. The episode was called Goobacks, and its central structural choice was a displacement. Rather than depicting undocumented Mexican workers crossing a real border, Trey Parker replaced the specific geography of the immigration debate with a time portal. A man appeared at the edge of South Park, crawling out of a shimmering opening in what looked unmistakably like the Colorado desert, covered in purple goo left over from the effects of traveling through time. He was from the year 3545. He had come to the present looking for work because the future he came from was overcrowded, economically depleted, and offered almost nothing in the way of employment. More men followed, then more, then families. South Park started filling up with workers from 1,000 years ahead who would take any job at any wage, because anything the present could offer was still better than what they had left behind. Season 8 was not a particularly experimental period for the show. It was a series running confidently on the formula Parker and Stone had refined over 7 years. Take a real-world controversy, replace its key variables with something absurd, and let the absurdity expose what the issue was actually about. Goobacks applied that formula to immigration with unusual precision. The time portal in the desert was a direct visual reference to the southern border. The Goobacks themselves, described in the episode as a hairless, racially uniform blend of all human populations speaking something close to a degraded Esperanto, represented the anxiety about cultural difference and assimilation that sat at the center of many anti-immigration arguments. Making them future workers rather than foreign nationals stripped away the specific politics of any real country and let the episode focus entirely on the economic and social mechanics of the anxiety itself. Nothing about their displacement was specific to Mexico or Canada or any named place. It was about the labor dynamic alone and what happened to communities when that dynamic shifted. Daryl Weathers, a construction worker from South Park, called the town meeting that became the episode's central scene. He was furious. A man from 1,000 years in the future had been willing to perform his job for wages so low they were barely symbolic, and the employer had made the obvious economic choice and replaced him. At the meeting, Daryl described what had happened in the plainest terms available to him. They had taken his job. The crowd agreed. They repeated the phrase back to him, and as more voices joined, the repetition began degrading. What started as 4 coherent words about economic displacement gradually became less intelligible. The first stage of decay produced something like a garbled regional accent, a slurred working-class rendering. Then the vowels started going wrong, the consonants followed, the phrase passed through several identifiable intermediate stages, each one slightly further from the original, before arriving at something that was essentially gibberish, a guttural rhythmic sound that retained the pulse of the original without any of its content. A crowd of grown men ended the sequence chanting something that could not be decoded by anyone who had not heard the start, united in furious agreement about nothing they could any longer put into words. Each repetition in that devolution was a step further from the real complaint underneath it. Daryl started with something genuine. A worker from the future had accepted wages so far below the going rate that no current resident could compete, and that had pushed someone out of work who depended on that income. That was a legitimate economic dynamic. The Goobacks were not presented as agents of malice. They were desperate people from a depleted world doing whatever they could to survive. The problem was structural, produced by conditions nobody in the scene had created or controlled. But the chant, as it devolved, made that structural problem invisible by replacing it with escalating emotional noise. By the time the crowd arrived at the gibberish end of the sequence, there was no content left in what they were saying, only rhythm and volume and shared fury. The episode was making a specific argument about how political rhetoric around immigration tends to work. The genuine economic anxiety at the bottom of it gets progressively buried under the performance of anger, and the performance sustains itself long after it has lost contact with the thing that originally justified it. Both sides of the debate received equal treatment throughout. The people who sympathized with the Goobacks were not portrayed as wise or compassionate. Randy Marsh, Stan's father, took the pro-immigrant position in the episode and dismissed the economic grievances of the displaced workers as straightforward bigotry. Stan had lost his snow shoveling job to a Gooback who did it for a fraction of what Stan charged. When Stan tried to explain this to his father, Randy showed no sympathy. He said the time travelers were doing jobs nobody wanted. Stan pushed back. He had wanted the job. Randy dismissed the objection and moved on. The episode gave Randy no more moral authority than it gave Daryl. Both Both characters were shown talking past the actual problem. Daryl and the crowd were losing themselves in theater that had disconnected from any specific fact. Randy was using a principled-sounding position to avoid acknowledging that real people with real financial needs had been pushed out by a labor dynamic they had no power to address. His dismissal was as content-free as the chant, just quieter and more self-satisfied. Watching both failure modes run simultaneously was where the episode's real argument lived. Parker and Stone were not interested in arbitrating which side was right. They were interested in showing how both sides of the immigration argument tended to prevent honest analysis from happening, one through emotional escalation that disconnected from any specific fact, and the other through reflexive moral positioning that treated economic concern as inherently suspect. Putting a 2004 audience in the position of watching both modes fail at once was a more honest depiction of the actual debate than most mainstream coverage managed, which tended to validate one side and mock the other depending on the outlet. The episode was not trying to produce a policy recommendation or signal which argument deserved to win. What it was built to do was put two failure modes in the same frame and let the audience watch them neutralize each other, while the actual problem stayed exactly where it was. One proposal that came out of the town meeting illustrated nativist logic pushed to its outer limit. A man suggested causing more global warming in the present, on the reasoning that a worse future climate would make conditions in the future miserable enough that nobody from there would bother traveling back to the present looking for work. Solving a labor market competition problem by deliberately damaging the planetary climate was presented without editorializing, as though it was a reasonable option sitting alongside any other. Another faction offered a different plan, a mass gay orgy among the men of South Park, intended to prevent the future from ever being populated and therefore prevent future immigrants from existing at all. Both proposals shared the same structure. They prioritized eliminating the immigrants over engaging with the conditions that produced the displacement in the first place. Neither plan even attempted to address what was actually happening. Both plans were dramatically easier to imagine than fixing the real thing. Hidden in the episode's word choice was a specific detail worth naming directly. The word goobax was not invented at random. The goo component referred to the purple substance the time travelers accumulated on their bodies during transit through the portal, but the back half of the compound word was a deliberate echo of a real slur used against Mexican immigrants crossing the southern border, and the show made no effort to obscure the connection. The invention of the fictional slur served as a way of surfacing the real word it rhymed with, so that the audience could not fully separate the episode's fantasy premise from the real immigration debate it was referencing. The characters in South Park who used the slur were doing exactly what people who used the real version were doing, taking a dehumanizing shorthand and applying it to a group of desperate people to make them easier to dismiss. The construction was also, in its way, a compliment to the audience, trusting viewers to make the connection without having it stated. Stan's counter-proposal went in the opposite direction from everything else the episode offered. He suggested that the people of the present try to improve conditions in the future so that the year 3045 would be a place worth living in and nobody from it would need to travel backward to find work. The town assembled for a montage of pro-social behavior, planting trees, recycling, giving to the poor, doing the kind of things that would, in theory, make a future civilization worth inhabiting. For a moment, the episode seemed headed toward a positive conclusion. Then it pulled back. Stan and Kyle observed that doing genuinely good things for the world was even more embarrassing than the mass gay orgy had been. The town agreed without much deliberation and returned to the orgy. The episode was not just mocking nativist responses, it was mocking the gap between knowing the correct answer and finding the correct answer acceptable. Having the right solution available and then choosing the absurd alternative because the right solution required more from people than they were willing to give was, the show suggested, a pretty reliable description of how these arguments actually ended. Precision in what Goobax achieved came from the Goobax themselves being designed without any real moral ambiguity about who they were. They were not criminals. They were not an invading force or a threat to anyone's safety. They came from poverty and despair. They worked hard. They took whatever they could get, and they had families they were trying to support from 1,000 years in the future. The episode went out of its way to establish that the economic pressure they created was genuine. They did undercut wages. They did displace workers who had nowhere comparable to turn. The economic argument against them was not dismissed as racism or paranoia, and yet every response to that real, structurally produced economic pressure was shown making things worse. The failure was not in the Goobax. The failure was in every available response to the conditions they created. Within a day of the episode airing, the phrase appeared in an Urban Dictionary submission. The entry was posted on April 29, 2004, the morning after broadcast, attributed the phrase to South Park, and described it as a satirical rendering of nativist frustration about job competition. The speed of that submission was a signal of how immediately the phrase had landed. Across early internet forums and the emerging infrastructure of early video sharing, clips from the episode episode circulated quickly. Bootleg video of the chant and its devolved versions was among the earliest pieces of political comedy to spread through the platforms that would eventually evolve into recognizable social media. The phrase became a shorthand in comment sections, deployed by people who knew the episode and were using it as ironic commentary on anti-immigration arguments. For a period, that was its primary cultural life. Irony proved fragile at the scale the phrase eventually reached. As the immigration debate intensified through the late Bush years, the Obama administration, and especially the 2015 and 2016 campaign season, the phrase migrated away from its satirical context. It began appearing in settings where the people using it showed no awareness of the South Park episode. They were just expressing the sentiment, the garbled, devolved versions, which had been designed specifically to show how rhetoric collapses under emotional pressure, showed up on signs at political rallies. They appeared in comment sections that read as entirely sincere expressions of frustration. A chant constructed to make that kind of political expression look ridiculous had been adopted by the people it was originally mocking, stripped of irony, and used straightforwardly. Once a phrase escapes its original context at sufficient scale, the satirical framing stops traveling with it. Satire requires the audience to recognize what is being satirized, and when that recognition is absent, what remains is the emotional content. The emotional content of the Goobacks chant was real regardless of the frame around it. Parker and Stone had taken a genuine economic anxiety, amplified it through absurdity until it sounded ridiculous, and produced a phrase that turned out to be fully usable as a sincere expression of that anxiety once the amplification was removed. That specific outcome would shadow everything the show tried to do on immigration for the next 2 decades. As the debate grew louder and the satirical distance the show depended on became harder to maintain. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. 7 years after Goobacks aired, the show returned to the border with a very different episode. This time, the movement was running in the opposite direction. Section 3, The Last of the Mohicans, and the direction nobody expected, Cartman's backyard, became the United States-Mexico border on a Friday night in South Park, and the game was simple enough. The boys had divided into 2 teams for a sleepover at Cartman's house. One team played the Border Patrol, led by Cartman, whose enthusiasm for the role was immediately apparent to anyone paying attention to how he assigned himself the authority and how quickly he established the rules in his own favor. The other team played Mexicans, whose job was to cross the border into Texas, which in the game's geography meant getting into Cartman's yard without being caught. The Mexicans ran, the Border Patrol chased, and crossing the line meant winning. Season 15's 10th episode, which aired on October 12, 2011, opened with this game and used it the way South Park games usually worked, as a frame that mapped the rules of an adult political reality onto a format simple enough to make those rules visible in a single glance. All the Mexicans made it across except one, Butters Stotch, who had been assigned to lead the Mexican team despite the rest of the boys considering him a particularly poor leader, fell behind during the crossing. Everyone else got into Texas. Butters did not. Cartman realized this meant the game was technically still running, and he settled in to wait, with the patience of someone for whom winning had become its own purpose. The rest of the boys began searching for Butters through the neighborhood. Cartman, rather than calling off the game, put up his own flyers instructing anyone who found Butters to shoot him on sight, unconcerned about whether the outcome was Butters dead or Butters caught, since either result would end the game in his favor. Butters, meanwhile, had wandered into the dark, disoriented and increasingly lost, and was eventually struck by a passing car. The couple inside, named the Whipples, looked at the small blonde child lying in the road and assumed, without much deliberation, that he was an undocumented Mexican immigrant. They took him home and immediately put him to work. Mantequilla was the name Butters gave when the Whipples asked who he was. Mantequilla is Spanish for butter, which made it an obvious alias for a character whose name was already Butters, but within the episode, it did something more specific than provide a pun. The name was all the Whipple couple required to confirm the assumption they had already made before they asked the question. Once they had a Spanish-sounding name attached to the small, obliging child they had brought home, the transaction was complete. Butters cleaned windows, washed dishes, raked leaves, and performed whatever household labor the Whipples directed him toward, at no wage, for a couple who treated the arrangement as entirely unremarkable. They fed him in the way one might feed a useful appliance, and assigned him further tasks. The Whipples were not depicted as malicious. They were depicted as people who had developed such settled expectations about where domestic labor came from and on what terms that a child in the road with a Spanish name was enough to activate the whole arrangement automatically, without a moment of ethical reflection entering the picture. What made the Whipple subplot more than a passing joke was what it showed about the American household as a structure. The family's daily functioning depended on labor that somebody was performing at a rate the family's own members had never been asked to match. Nobody in the household seemed to have recently attempted the tasks Butters was was doing. There was no moment where anyone suggested they could handle the work themselves if Mantequilla were not available. The work was simply there, waiting to be directed at someone, and the someone was whoever arrived in the right-sounding form. The Whipple family was a microcosm of the larger economic argument the episode was building toward, and by the time the argument arrived in full, the family had already demonstrated it at the most intimate possible scale. Restaurant staff later recognized Butters from missing posters the other boys had distributed. When they asked what he needed, Butters said he needed to get back to his amigos at the border. He meant the other boys from the game in Cartman's backyard. The staff heard something entirely different. A Spanish-speaking person expressing a desire to cross the border back to Mexico, recognized from circulated images as someone notable enough to have a search mounted for him, read to them as a political act. Word spread that Mantequilla was returning home. The Mexican immigrant workers who heard this understood his desire to rejoin his friends as a call to return to Mexico themselves, and they began going back. The episode allowed this misunderstanding to propagate at speed, treating the gap between what Butters meant and what everyone else heard as the mechanism for the entire central plot. Nobody had anticipated the economic consequences. Mexicans returned to Mexico in such numbers and with such speed that the industries relying on their labor began feeling the absence within days. Lawns went unmowed, construction slowed down, kitchens became understaffed, agricultural work that had been performed by the same workforce for decades suddenly had no one to perform it. Crops and fields had no one to harvest them. Restaurants had nobody to run their prep stations. Households that had been outsourcing domestic work found themselves facing labor they had not planned to perform themselves and discovered they were not prepared to perform it. Americans in the show's South Park tried to fill the gap and largely failed, not from inability, but from a deep unfamiliarity with the pace and volume of work that the departed workforce had simply been doing every day as a matter of course. The economy of South Park collapsed, not because of something anyone had done wrong, but because a labor arrangement that nobody had ever fully acknowledged had stopped functioning. While the economic spiral accelerated, the actual United States Border Patrol found itself in a position the episode used to deliver its sharpest satirical observation. Cartman had joined the real Border Patrol as a volunteer, technically still trying to intercept Butters before he crossed back into the country and win the original game. But the agents he was working alongside were not trying to stop anyone from entering. They had reversed direction entirely. The Border Patrol was now physically preventing Mexican workers from leaving, stopping people at the line and ordering them back to their jobs inside the country. The episode staged this reversal with almost no commentary, as if it followed naturally from what the economic situation required. Of course, the border was now functioning to keep the labor supply in place rather than to restrict entry. The border had always been managing that supply. The reversal just made visible what the arrangement had always been doing beneath the official policy language. Cartman's arc throughout made this point from a different angle. His enthusiasm for Border Patrol had been absolute from the opening scene of the game in the backyard, and nothing changed when he joined the real agency. He was pursuing Butters with the single-mindedness of someone for whom the goal had long since ceased to be connected to any specific reason. By the end of the episode, the Border Patrol agents who were technically his colleagues were working against him, actively helping Butters cross back into the United States, because a Mexican wanting to enter the country was now exactly what the situation called for. Cartman's drive to stop the crossing put him in direct conflict with the institution he had joined to enforce it. The border, in the episode's logic, was not organized around keeping people out. It was organized around managing who was available to do the work the economy needed done, and disrupting that management in either direction produced consequences that nobody in charge had planned for. Butters had become a genuine folk hero in Mexico by the time the episode reached its second act. He arrived at the Zocalo in Mexico City and was received with the kind of public enthusiasm reserved for someone who had given a people something they needed. His speech to the crowd was about wanting to get back to his friends in a backyard game in a Colorado suburb. The crowd heard a political leader calling the Mexican people toward renewed national dignity. Both things were simultaneously true from the perspectives of the people in the scene. Butters was not cynically manipulating anyone. The people receiving him were not being irrational. The disconnect was produced entirely by context, and the episode allowed both realities to coexist without resolving either of them into the correct reading. South Park built this episode around an inversion that Goobax had not attempted. The 2004 episode had asked what happened when immigrants arrived in large enough numbers to disrupt a labor market. The 2011 episode asked what happened when they left. The two questions mirrored each other, and the answers the show gave were mirrors as well. Arrival in Goobax created economic displacement that produced a politics of fear and exclusion. Departure in the 2011 episode created economic collapse that produced a politics of desperation and reversal. Together, the two episodes described the same underlying reality from opposite approaches. The American economic arrangement, at least as the show depicted it, was organized around a specific kind of labor performed by by specific kinds of people on terms nobody ever openly negotiated, and changing that arrangement in any direction produced instability that the people benefiting most from it were least equipped to handle. Choosing Butters as the episode's central character rather than one of the four main boys was a decision with real consequences for how the satire worked. Butters was the show's designated innocent, the character most likely to stumble into a situation rather than engineer it, and the most likely to mean exactly what he said without any ironic subtext. His identity as Montequila was genuine rather than strategic. He was not performing an immigrant identity to make a political point. He was lost and using the name that came naturally from the situation he found himself in. That guilelessness made the episode's central mechanism work. If Cartman had been mistaken for Mantequilla, the story would have been about Cartman exploiting the situation. With Butters, the story was about a situation that exploited itself, because the conditions for exploitation already existed and were just waiting for a Mantequilla-shaped object to activate them. Goobax had made its argument through time travel abstraction, filtering the immigration dynamic into a fantasy that stripped away every specific geographic and cultural detail to expose the economic mechanics underneath. The 2011 episode worked in the opposite direction, staying close to the actual border, actual industries, and actual political language of the moment. The shift between the two approaches reflected where the immigration debate had moved in the 7 years between them. By 2011, the conversation had become more specific and more tied to concrete policy decisions that were producing visible effects in real communities. Arizona's SB 1070 law, passed in 2010, had required state and local enforcement officers to check the immigration status of anyone they suspected of being undocumented. Record deportation numbers under the Obama administration were climbing at the same time that comprehensive reform legislation was failing to advance in Congress. The political pressure was operating in the same contradictory directions the episode staged, intensifying enforcement in one direction, while depending on the workforce, the enforcement was removing in the other. Neither the show's warmth toward Butters nor its satire of Cartman produced any policy recommendation. The episode ended with Butters back in Colorado. The backyard game concluded in his favor, and the economic argument about immigrant labor left hanging in the air without a resolution attached to it. South Park had never been interested in telling people what immigration policy should look like. It was interested in putting the actual structure of the problem into the sharpest available light and leaving it there. The Last of the Mohicans left behind a picture of the border as a mechanism for managing labor rather than protecting a nation, the American household as a structure built partly on work it had never fully accounted for, and the Border Patrol as an institution whose real function shifted based on which direction the economic pressure was flowing. None of those observations were unknown before the episode aired. All of them were treated in mainstream political discourse as too obvious to say out loud, or too uncomfortable to say plainly. South Park said them through a lost 10-year-old looking for his friends, and then moved directly on to the next episode. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. 4 years after Mantequilla walked back across the border, the show turned immigration into its biggest season-long story yet, and the character it chose to lead that story had been making the same proposal at Christmas meetings since 1997. Section 4, Season 19, The Trump Stand-In and the Wall That Faced the Wrong Way. June 2015 was when Mr. Garrison stopped being a background joke and became the most relevant character on television. South Park had just started developing Season 19, and the timing could not have been stranger. Garrison had spent 18 years raising his hand at Christmas meetings, suggesting the same solution, and getting told no by the mayor every single time. And then, that summer, a real politician descended an escalator in New York and said something about Mexico sending drugs, crime, and rapists across the southern border. The line landed differently in different rooms, but inside the South Park writers' room, it landed like a key turning in a lock. The character they had been writing since 1997 had just walked into actual politics. Garrison had always been the joke that nobody took seriously. The question now was what to do with him when the joke had become real. Donald Trump as a direct target presented a specific creative problem. Parker and Stone had spent close to 2 decades building their approach around the principle that no individual person was really the target. They went after positions and failure modes rather than specific named individuals, partly from ethical instinct and partly because locking the show's satire to any one person meant the satire left the show when that person left the conversation. Mr. Garrison solved this. He was already in the series, already established as someone whose xenophobia and political ambition had been running as recurring background notes since the pilot, and already capable of saying the things that Garrison's psychology made available to him. Mapping Trump's 2015 campaign rhetoric onto a character who had been suggesting the same policy at Christmas town meetings for 17 seasons required almost no construction. Parker and Stone did not have to build a Trump character from the ground up. The character had been there since the beginning, waiting for the political moment to catch catch up with what he had always believed and always said out loud. PC Principal arrived at South Park Elementary in the season 19 premiere that aired September 16, 2015, replacing the school's previous principal without much explanation offered or needed. He was physically imposing, and his entire identity was organized around enforcing political correctness, policing the language and behavior of everyone around him with a ferocity that the show depicted as both ideologically sincere and practically indistinguishable from bullying. His arrival gave the season an antagonist force that operated on a different register from anything the show had featured before. PC Principal represented the cultural left's tendency to enforce norms through social pressure and institutional power, while Garrison represented the backlash that kind of enforcement reliably produced. Placing both characters in the same school building and letting the tension between them structure the season's serialized arc was the central creative decision season 19 was built around. Parker and Stone called their approach serialized light, meaning storylines would develop and carry consequences from one episode to the next in a way the show had never attempted for a full season, and immigration was the thread that made the continuity possible. Mr. Garrison's transformation from irritable schoolteacher to political candidate began in the season's second episode, which aired September 23, 2015. Canadian immigrants had flooded into South Park, filling desks at the elementary school, disrupting classroom routines, and generally making Garrison feel that the place he had inhabited for decades had become unrecognizable to him. PC Principal's response was to require the faculty to take Canadian language classes to better serve the new students. Garrison's response to that requirement was political. He composed a song called "Where My Country Gone" that expressed his nativist frustration in operatically public terms, performing it in front of the town as a declaration of his position. The song contained a lyric implying it had taken 43 presidents to make the country stand tall, and just one unnamed figure to undo it, and another line reading "the land of the free" as a designation intended specifically for people like Garrison. The performance made no attempt to moderate the sentiment or present it sympathetically. It was as loud and as unbecoming as the show could make it, which was the point. Garrison was not being presented as someone to agree with. He was being presented as someone whose loudness was contagious regardless. Canada was not the obvious source for the episode's immigration crisis, and that choice was the episode's most precise satirical decision. Garrison's rage was calibrated to match the real-world rhetoric around Mexican immigration exactly, but the immigrants filling his classroom were white, English-speaking Canadians from a country that had been a close American ally for the full duration of the nation's history. Nothing about their presence in South Park modified Garrison's response in any way. He was as furious about Canadians as the real-world version of his argument was furious about Mexicans. The specific identity of the immigrants was not the operative variable in his anger. They were outsiders in his space, and that was sufficient. Swapping the nationality allowed the episode to separate the economic and cultural anxieties driving the nativist argument from the specific ethnic prejudice often bundled into it. Garrison's sentiment operated independently of any particular group's characteristics. Whatever it was rooted in, it was not rooted in anything unique to the group it had most recently found a target in. When Garrison proposed building a wall to keep the Canadians out, the episode allowed his political energy to build momentum in the way real political energy tended to build momentum. He was loud and confident and offered a solution that felt decisive. PC Principal pushed back but could not contain the swell. Garrison had the town largely behind him by the time the plan was approaching something like implementation. Then the reversal arrived. Canada had already built a wall, a substantial one, constructed specifically to keep Americans out, and a Canadian border guard delivered the explanation to Garrison without particular hostility. The wall protected Canada's women and preserved things worth protecting. The episode had taken Trump's single most recognizable policy proposal, the wall that was going to solve the immigration problem, and reflected it back from the other side of the border. Every structural argument for a wall was symmetrical. Anyone could construct it. Canada had already constructed it. What the wall was protecting and what it was excluding depended entirely on which side of it you were standing on, and nobody building a wall had spent much time thinking about what the view looked like from the other direction. Crossing into Canada meant Garrison had to get over the wall himself, which he accomplished by taking an empty barrel over Niagara Falls. What he found on the other side was a country that had collapsed. The streets were empty. Cities had been abandoned. The infrastructure of a functioning society had deteriorated into something recognizable as ruin. The Canadian president was still there, and when Garrison located him, the episode confirmed what had happened. During Canada's last election, voters had supported a brash, dismissive candidate who said outrageous things and offered no realistic solutions to actual problems. Many people had voted for him as entertainment, or as protest, or out of genuine conviction that his disruption was worth trying, and not enough people had taken the possibility of his actual election seriously enough to prevent it. He won. The consequences were what Garrison was now standing in. Canada had become uninhabitable. Its people had fled south to look for something better. The immigrants in South Park had not arrived because of some failing of their own. They had arrived because their own version of the argument Garrison was making had already played out all the way to its conclusion, and the conclusion was a country nobody wanted to live in anymore. Finding the Canadian Trump in his ruined country was the episode's most specific argument about the 2015 political moment, and the argument was not subtle even if the show declined to state it directly. Garrison was angry about immigrants in his town. The episode showed that those immigrants were produced by the same political failure mode Garrison himself embodied. The thing he was campaigning to become in the United States had already happened in Canada, and the consequence was standing in front of him in the form of everyone who had crossed the border south. Garrison was simultaneously the solution he was promising and the cause of the displacement he was outraged about. The episode laid this out carefully and then let it sit without commentary, trusting that the structure alone was sufficient. Running for president came at the end of the episode, with Garrison announcing his candidacy and naming Caitlyn Jenner as his running mate before the two of them departed for Washington. Jenner's role echoed Sarah Palin's function in the 2008 campaign, where a celebrity presence had been added to a ticket in a way that generated enthusiasm disconnected from governing competence. Jenner's recurring gag throughout season 19 involved running over pedestrians while driving, always moving forward regardless of what was in the way, and the image of Garrison and Jenner leaving for Washington with this established pattern intact was a fairly direct description of what the show thought a Garrison presidency would look like in practice. The episode ended with the Canadian immigrants returning home because their own president had been eliminated, which resolved the immigration storyline in the second episode and freed the rest of the season to develop Garrison's presidential arc into something larger. Caitlyn Jenner's function in season 19 deserves a moment of attention because it illustrated how the show was working at multiple satirical registers simultaneously. Jenner had come out publicly earlier that year in one of the most widely covered celebrity announcements of 2015, and the season 19 premiere had already engaged with the culture war around her transition. Using her as Garrison's running mate allowed the show to connect the political correctness debate, the immigration debate, and the celebrity culture debate into a single image. A candidate embodying every anti-PC impulse was running on a ticket with someone who had become a symbol of PC culture's most contested front. The pairing was absurd in the way the show's best political images were absurd, too on the nose to miss, and too weird to dismiss. Writing season 19 in real time while Trump's actual campaign was developing meant the satirical target was moving at the same pace as the writing. Parker and Stone had built their production model to allow near real-time responsiveness to current events, and season 19 was the fullest deployment of that capability in the show's history. When they were writing the Canadian Wall episode, Trump was rising in Republican primary polling. When they were writing the season's later episodes through November 2015, Trump was polling first nationally in the Republican primary and showing no signs of falling back. The show was not predicting anything. It was describing a present that kept arriving faster than the satire could settle around it, and the production pace that had always been one of South Park's core strengths was now the only thing keeping the show inside the story it was trying to tell. Kyle's position throughout season 19 served as a consistent marker for where good faith political engagement had arrived by 2015. Near the end of the second episode, Kyle started to deliver a speech that would have offered some perspective on what had happened with the Canadian immigrants. He stopped himself before finishing, because nobody wanted another Kyle speech. That small moment carried more honest political observation than most of the explicit arguments the season contained. The character who typically offered clarity had internalized the understanding that clarity was not what the moment wanted, and had chosen silence rather than be dismissed again. The speeches were not moving anything. The political situation was developing according to its own momentum, and the thoughtful observer watching it knew that his thoughtfulness had become functionally irrelevant. Some critical responses to season 19 described it as the show's most ambitious and coherent season in years. A reviewer at the New York Times called it something close to a grand, if messy, unified theory of anger, inequality, and disillusionment in 2015 America, a description that captured what the season was attempting, even when individual episodes did not fully deliver on it. Immigration had not been the only subject of season 19, but it had been the load-bearing structure on which the season's larger argument rested. Without the Canadian immigrants, Garrison had no platform. Without the platform, the season had no engine for exploring what that kind of political energy does to a community once it builds momentum. By the finale, which aired December 9th, 2015, Garrison was headed to Washington. The show had positioned him as a fictional analog to a real candidate still running in an actual Republican primary. And Parker and Stone had every expectation that both fictional and real versions of this story would end the same way, with the candidate losing and life returning more or less to normal. That expectation did not survive the following November. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Garrison kept running, then he won. Parker and Stone had built an entire season finale around him losing, and when the real election came back, they had to rewrite everything while the episodes were already on the air. Section 5. Garrison as President, the Pandemic, and the Policy of Extinction, November 8, 2016, landed differently inside the South Park writers' room than it did almost anywhere else in American television, because Parker and Stone had built that evening's episode around a specific outcome they had not questioned until the results started coming in. The planned episode was titled The Very First Gentleman, constructed on the assumption that Hillary Clinton would win the presidency and that the Garrison arc could conclude with a decisive satirical defeat. When the actual results made that ending impossible, Parker and Stone rewrote the episode on election night, working through the hours between the networks calling the race and the broadcast time the following evening. The episode that aired was called Oh Geez, and it dropped almost every prepared storyline to simply depict a community in a state of shock. Randy Marsh watched the results and said, quietly, that this was not how it was supposed to happen. The writers, working in the most compressed deadline the show had ever faced, had produced something that functioned less as a joke than as a documentary of a specific emotional state. There were very few laughs. There was something close to genuine bewilderment. Parker and Stone had built the entire preceding season around a candidate who could not actually win, and now they had to figure out what the show was when that candidate was president. Garrison's presidential arc had been constructed with a losing ending baked into its structure. Season 20 had been the most narratively complicated season the show had attempted, weaving together storylines about online trolling, social justice, advertising, and the election, and the Garrison thread was supposed to land on a defeat that reset the board. The sudden requirement to continue the character as an actual elected president created problems the serialized structure was not designed to accommodate. Parker and Stone acknowledged later that they could not resolve several of Season 20's storylines in a satisfying way because the finale had to be rewritten while earlier episodes were already locked and broadcast. Plots that had been seeded through the season went unresolved. Arcs that had seemed to be building towards something were quietly abandoned. The season ended with a sense of incompletion that critics noticed and that the creators themselves later reflected on with some discomfort. The real election had interrupted the fictional one at the worst possible moment for the structure of the narrative. Member berries had introduced something early in Season 20 that turned out to be the sharpest piece of political observation the season contained. Small grape-like fruits that induced waves of nostalgia, member berries caused anyone who consumed them to fall into a reverie about the way things used to be, muttering fond recollections of old movies, old cultural touchstones, and, at the edges of the joke, a time back when there weren't so many Mexicans around. The berries were presented as addictive, their comforting nostalgia becoming impossible to resist, even as the memories they induced grew darker and more exclusionary. As a metaphor for the emotional engine driving the 2016 electorate, the member berries were one of South Park's most economical inventions, a single absurd image that contained the whole political dynamic of nostalgia as political fuel. The way appeals to a better past worked on audiences, even when the past being invoked was neither better for everyone nor clearly remembered correctly. The immigration dimension was embedded in the berries' effects rather than stated as the central argument, which made it land harder than a more direct approach would have. Trying to Lose was the unexpected arc Season 20 built around Garrison himself, and it was more politically honest than the show usually allowed itself to be. Once Garrison realized he had a genuine chance of winning an election he had not designed to win, he became frightened by the prospect of actually having to govern. He attempted various maneuvers to alienate his supporters, including sitting down during the national anthem at a sporting event, an act that in the show's environment simply became absorbed into his support base without damage. Everything he tried that should have cost him voters instead seemed to strengthen his position. The joke was about the specific resilience of a political movement that has decided its candidate represents something beyond the candidate himself, so that the candidate's actual behavior becomes irrelevant to the decision voters have already made. Garrison was trying to be disqualified by his own supporters and discovering that disqualification was not available to him. Two things happened simultaneously from the moment Garrison won the presidency that shaped everything the show did with him over the following 4 seasons. First, Parker and Stone found themselves in the position of having a fictional character occupying the same political role as a real person, which created satirical complications that had not existed when Garrison was a candidate. Every episode featuring Garrison as president was implicitly also about Trump as president, which meant every decision about what Garrison did was also a decision about how to frame the current real-world government. Second, the real Trump administration was producing news stories so rapidly and so strangely that keeping up with them through an episode that took a week to make became genuinely difficult. Parker said later that satire had become reality, and that the real thing was often funnier than anything he could write. The consequence was that Garrison, as a presidential character, appeared less frequently and less centrally in season seasons 21 and 22 than the setup had implied. President Garrison in season 21 retained his anti-Canadian animus from the earlier seasons, which now had the resources of the actual executive branch behind it. An episode called Doubling Down in season 21 examined the political psychology of supporter loyalty. Garrison's approval ratings were low, his behavior was erratic, and people who supported him were beginning to feel some embarrassment about having done so. But the episode's observation was that supporter embarrassment did not produce withdrawal of support. It produced doubling down, a reinforcement of the original commitment, precisely because acknowledging error felt more costly than continuing to back someone whose behavior had become difficult to defend. The immigration dimension was present in the background of Garrison's presidency without being foregrounded in season 21 the way it would be later, because the show was managing too many other targets simultaneously. Approval ratings that were described as very low in the show's fictional universe did not protect Canada from what happened in the season 21 episode Super Hard PC-ness. Garrison, at his Oval Office desk, opened the nuclear football and launched a nuclear weapon at Toronto. The bomb detonated and killed over 1 million Canadians, a figure confirmed in the following episode's aftermath. The episode's causal logic was deliberately absurd. Kyle had been agitating to have Canadian entertainment cancelled on the grounds that it was corrupting people, and Garrison, hearing Kyle's aggressive rhetoric from the Oval Office, launched the strike in a moment that the show played as an almost casual decision. The scale of the act and the casualness of the decision-making were the two elements that needed to coexist to make the observation work. Using a nuclear weapon on a neighboring country was depicted as the kind of thing a Garrison presidency might do because it was angry at Canada, because it had the capability, and because nobody in the room was stopping it. Toronto's destruction in the show's fictional universe had downstream consequences. The following episode established that Justin Trudeau was demanding that Garrison be handed over to Canada to face accountability, and that Garrison had fled rather than face that accountability. The immigration direction had been reversed again. A character who had built his political career on keeping people out of the country was now a fugitive from an international criminal complaint. The show did not develop this arc into a full resolution. Garrison remained at large, the demand from Trudeau unmet, and season 22 brought a significant reduction in Garrison's presence. He appeared in that season's finale, Bike Parade, briefly in handcuffs, with no surrounding explanation for how he had arrived at that position. The handcuffs were both a visual nod to the accountability demand and a placeholder, the show acknowledging that something had happened to Garrison without committing to what it was. After that brief appearance in season 22, the show largely withdrew Garrison from its main storylines through season 23, which had its own extensive ICE storyline to manage. When Garrison returned as a major character in season 24, it was in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, and his reappearance brought the immigration dimension of his presidency into its starkest expression. The pandemic special aired September 30th, 2020, ran 48 minutes rather than the show's usual 22, and was the highest-rated South Park episode in 7 years. Stan Marsh called the White House to ask President Garrison for help managing the pandemic's effect on South Park's children. Garrison took the call and explained, without apparent embarrassment, that he was choosing not to do anything about the pandemic because it was disproportionately killing Mexicans, and that outcome was useful to him. Ignoring the country's public health emergency because the virus was doing immigration enforcement work was the logical endpoint of the Garrison presidency's immigration argument, spelled out more directly than the show had ever stated any political position. Every earlier version of Garrison's anti-immigrant sentiment had been channeled through policy proposals, song lyrics, or political rhetoric. The pandemic special stripped all of that away and had Garrison state the position in plain terms. The disease was killing the population he had wanted to eliminate since his first Christmas town meeting in 1997, and he was going to leave it alone. There was no longer any pretense of policy. It was purely a statement of preferred demographic outcome. The comedy of the moment was bleak and deliberately so, because the episode was not interested in making the position seem absurd through exaggeration. It was interested in making it seem real by stating it plainly. Real satire requires distance between the satirical version and the thing being satirized, and by 2020 that distance had largely closed. Parker told an Australian television program around this time that it had become tricky because satire had become reality, and that what was actually happening was funnier than anything he could write. He said the show had been trying to make fun of what was going on, but found it could not keep up. Matt Stone said in a Vanity Fair interview that elections were particularly hard to do because they scrambled everything and took on outsized importance. The admission was significant, coming from two people who had built their careers on the claim that they could make anything into a joke. The Trump administration, and specifically its immigration policies, had produced a reality that the show kept bumping against rather than floating above. Garrison was useful as a character during this period precisely because his fictional presidency could do things that South Park was not sure how to say about the real one, but the fictional version kept getting outpaced. Losing Losing the election in the South Park Q vaccination special, which aired March 10, 2021, ended Garrison's fictional presidency and closed a narrative arc that had started in a 2015 classroom where he was furious about Canadian language classes. The episode confirmed that Garrison had lost the 2020 election to a candidate identified only as the president-elect, and it returned him to South Park Elementary as a teacher. The resolution was not triumphant. Garrison came back changed by the experience of having held power he had never fully known what to do with, and the show's handling of his return was careful not to treat his departure from the White House as a vindication of anything. He had gone to Washington. He had behaved exactly as the character always behaved when given access to power, which was badly. He had come back. Returning Garrison to South Park closed a loop that had opened on August 13, 1997, when the character first appeared in the pilot episode. He had spent 24 years as a teacher, a political candidate, a president, a nuclear aggressor, and a fugitive, before returning to the classroom. His immigration politics had not changed in any of those roles. He had proposed eliminating Mexican immigrants as a joke at a Christmas meeting in season 1, and had, as a fictional president, attempted to use a pandemic as a policy instrument for achieving the same outcome in season 24. The escalation was the show's argument about where those sentiments led when they were given institutional power rather than dismissed by the mayor at a town meeting. The Christmas gag had always been the same gag, but what the gag was describing had never been trivial, and the show spent 8 seasons with Garrison in the White House, demonstrating what happened when the proposal stopped being dismissed. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Garrison's presidency made the immigration argument explicit in ways the show had never managed before, but while he was in the White House, the show was also building something else, an episode set inside a real agency, with real children and aluminum foil for blankets. Section 6, Mexican Joker, ICE, and the aluminum foil blankets. September 25, 2019, was when South Park changed the register of its immigration commentary in a way that none of the previous episodes had quite managed. The show had spent 15 years approaching the topic through satire that maintained some degree of fictional displacement, future workers through a time portal, Canadian immigrants fleeing a ruined country, a folk hero made of a lost 10-year-old, a presidential campaign built on xenophobia. Mexican Joker was something different. It put a named ICE agency on screen by name, depicted its officers separating families at a suburban doorstep, sent a main character to a detention facility with specific conditions that mirrored what journalists were reporting from real detention centers at the time, and held the camera there for most of the episode's runtime without flinching toward absurdity as a relief valve. The show was still a comedy, and the episode still had jokes, but the target had shifted from the politics of immigration to the machinery of enforcement, and the machinery was depicted with an accuracy that made the jokes land harder than usual. Diego's arrest happened at the opening of the episode, in front of Steven Stotch's house. Diego was Steven's gardener, undocumented, and ICE had received an anonymous tip that there was an illegal alien working at the property. Agents arrived, escorted Diego out, and separated him from his wife and children at the curb. His wife and kids showed up as this was happening, and the officers responded by putting the adults and children in separate vehicles and explaining they would be taken to detention centers. Cartman was watching from nearby, taking in the mechanics of the situation with the focused attention of someone who has just identified a useful tool. He asked an officer how it worked. The answer confirmed what he had suspected. Anyone could call in a tip. The whole system was designed to accept anonymous reports from any member of the public without any requirement of evidence or personal knowledge of the situation. Eric Cartman had never needed much of an invitation to weaponize a system against Kyle Broflovsky, and the anonymous ICE tip line was the most powerful instrument anyone had ever handed him. He made a call. He reported that there were undocumented immigrants living at the Broflovsky residence. Shortly afterward, ICE officers arrived at the Broflovsky home. Ike opened the door and immediately began crying. The officers entered, explained they had received a tip, and arrested the entire household. Sheila, Gerald, Kyle, and Ike were all taken. The family was separated at the scene. The episode cut to Cartman watching from his bedroom window, satisfied. The legal basis for what had just happened was an anonymous phone call from a child with a grudge, and nothing in the scene suggested the system had malfunctioned. It had done exactly what it was designed to do. Arriving at the detention center, Kyle found himself in a yard full of Mexican children who had been separated from their parents at the border, all of them wearing the same expression of confused fear. He was the only non-Latino in the facility, and the episode used that displacement immediately. ICE staff Jeff Corrigan and a colleague named Dave, introduced as a terrible Spanish translator, welcomed the children to the facility with a cheerfulness that the scene deliberately calibrated to be more disturbing than open hostility would have been. Jeff spoke in the tone of someone running an orientation for a disappointing summer camp, acknowledging that the children had been separated from their families, but promising that there was a lot of fun to be had inside. He handed each child a a single piece of aluminum foil as they walked in and directed them to a gated room with sleeping bags on the floor. Jeff Corrigan was one of the episode's most carefully constructed characters, and the care that went into him was evident in how the show declined to make him a monster. He was polite. He was capable of noticing that individual children were suffering. He was not enthusiastic about the work in the way that Cartman was enthusiastic about the anonymous tip line. He was a bureaucrat performing a function within a system he had joined because the salary was adequate, and he had developed the particular psychological adaptation that allowed people to perform genuinely harmful work by keeping their attention on the specific task in front of them rather than the structure the task was part of. Dave was worse at this adaptation and showed it more. When the staff realized that Kyle was Jewish rather than Hispanic, Jeff pulled him aside and explained the situation with something approaching embarrassment. Kyle had been sent there because, as Jeff put it, some fat, intolerant person had filed a false report. The Jewish identity created a problem the facility was not equipped to manage because detaining someone Jewish looked like something the staff had strong institutional reasons to avoid. Living conditions at the facility were depicted with specificity that was clearly drawn from the journalism that had been covering real detention centers for the preceding year. Children slept on the floor of a gated room. They had no beds and no pillows. The single piece of aluminum foil they had been handed on arrival served as both blanket and bedding, and the episode used that detail without elaboration because it did not need elaboration. Photographs and first-hand reports from journalists and advocates who had gained access to real ICE detention facilities in 2018 and 2019 had documented children wrapped in space blankets, sleeping on cold floors, in facilities that were overcrowded and understaffed. The show did not exaggerate the conditions, because the conditions, as reported, were already past the threshold of what most audiences would have accepted as plausible satire. Depicting them accurately was enough. From the moment Kyle recognized what the facility was doing to the children around him, the episode built toward a speech that was the most direct political statement South Park's immigration coverage had produced in 15 years of approaching the topic. Kyle asked the staff directly whether they understood what they were accomplishing. He asked whether they knew they were traumatizing these children and teaching them to fear and resent the government. And then he made his central argument that the conditions they were creating, the fear and the humiliation and the sense of abandonment and injustice that the children were absorbing every day, were a supervillain origin story. He called this potential figure the Mexican Joker, drawing on the 2019 film whose title character's villainy was rooted in systematic mistreatment by a society that had no interest in his well-being. The warning was not that any specific child in the facility would become a terrorist. It was that systems designed to produce maximum suffering in vulnerable people did not produce passive acceptance. They produced people who remembered. ICE's response to the Mexican Joker warning demonstrated the show's specific satirical mechanism at full power. The staff became obsessed with identifying which child in the facility would become the Mexican Joker so that they could prevent it from happening. Jeff organized a puppet show intended to model forgiveness, using a Mexican Joker puppet to demonstrate that wronged people should choose grace rather than revenge. The show within the show had the puppet refusing to forgive and then being presented as morally inferior for that refusal, which was the episode's sharpest joke. A system that had traumatized children was now staging entertainment designed to instruct those children that their anger at being traumatized was the real moral failing. When the puppet show failed to produce the desired result, the staff administered electroshock therapy to children in the facility, reasoning that if they could eliminate the trauma response, they could eliminate the future Mexican Joker. Jeff burst in on this procedure and demanded they stop, but the framing made clear that his objection was logistical rather than moral. They were creating exactly the kind of traumatic memory that would produce the outcome they were trying to prevent. Aluminum foil was what Kyle had, and Kyle found a use for it. He organized the children in the facility to fold their blankets into yarmulkes, making them look Jewish, in the hope that the staff's documented aversion to being seen as anti-Semitic would extend to releasing everyone. It was a plan that could only work inside the specific absurd logic of the episode's version of ICE, where the institution's vulnerability to accusations of Jewish discrimination was so powerful that a facility full of children wearing foil hats could trigger a crisis response. The lead ICE agent, already wound up by his fear of producing the Mexican Joker, experienced what the episode described as a flashback to the origin story he had been trying to prevent. He became convinced he was living inside the traumatic moment that would create the figure he feared. He shot his colleagues and released the children in a panic before fleeing. The resolution was absurd, but the mechanism that produced it was real. The episode was showing what happened when institutional self-protection mattered more to an organization than the function the organization was supposedly performing. Beyond the plot mechanics, the episode was making a specific argument about the anonymous tip system that ICE operated during this period. By centering the Broflovsky family's detention on a false report filed by a child with a grudge, The show depicted the tip line as a system designed around the assumption that reports were credible rather than the assumption that they should be verified. A system that accepted any anonymous report without evidence as sufficient grounds to separate a family was a system that could be used by anyone with access to a phone and a reason to want someone gone. The episode did not claim this was unique to Cartman's particular malice. It claimed the system was structured to accommodate his malice as readily as it accommodated any legitimate concern, because the architecture of the anonymous tip did not distinguish between them. Zero tolerance was the policy that had produced the real-world conditions the episode was depicting. Attorney General Jeff Sessions had announced it in April 2018, requiring criminal prosecution of all adults who crossed the border without authorization, which meant parents were being held in criminal custody while their children were classified as unaccompanied minors and held in separate facilities under Health and Human Services rather than with their parents under ICE. By May 31, 2018, nearly 2,000 children had been separated. By June 9th, the number was above 2,000. The administration's public accounting of where the children were and how to reunite them was so inadequate that months later, with a court order demanding reunification, the government was able to locate and return only around 40% of the separated children within the deadline. Hundreds of parents were deported without their children. Some children waited in vans in Texas heat for 39 hours to see parents who were standing a short distance away. The Mexican Joker episode aired 15 months after the peak of this crisis, while reporting on ongoing family separation continued, and while the government's admission that reunification could take up to 2 years was still relatively recent news. Critical response to Mexican Joker was mixed in ways that reflected how the show's immigration episodes had generally been received when they were most pointed. Chris Longo at Den of Geek gave the episode 2 out of 5 stars, and the season overall drew a smaller audience than South Park had seen in previous years, with the premiere drawing under 1 million viewers on its original broadcast. Audiences who had followed the show's political coverage appreciated the directness of the ICE treatment. Others felt the episode's parallel storyline about Randy Marsh's marijuana farm prevented it from fully sustaining the weight of what it was trying to say. The criticism that the episode was too busy was legitimate, but the immigration storyline at its center was the show's most sustained single engagement with a specific enforcement mechanism in 22 years of immigration coverage. Everything the episode did differently from its predecessors came down to specificity. Goobax had made its point through temporal abstraction, The Last of the Mohicans had made it through geographic displacement, and a protagonist who stumbled into the argument rather than choosing it, where My Country Gone had filtered its target through a Canadian lens that allowed the satirical logic to work at a slight remove from the real thing. Mexican Joker named ICE put an ICE badge on screen, depicted an ICE detention facility with conditions drawn from real reporting, and assigned the role of the person who weaponized ICE's anonymous tip line to Cartman, the show's most reliable vehicle for depicting the psychology of someone who finds institutional cruelty useful. The show had been approaching this specific subject for 15 years. In September 2019, it stopped approaching and arrived. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. 6 years later, South Park returned to ICE with a new episode, a new character inside the agency, and a satirical target precise enough that the actual Department of Homeland Security tried to use the show's own footage to recruit for the agency it was mocking. Section 7. Got a Nut, Kristi Noem, and the agency that used the mockery to recruit masked ICE agents were showing up everywhere by the summer of 2025. Videos of arrests circulated online every single day. Parking lots, school zones, workplaces, farms, where workers had been detained mid-shift and left crops standing in the fields with nobody to harvest them. ICE was no longer operating quietly through tip lines and courthouse arrests. It was conducting operations that were designed to be seen. Kristi Noem, confirmed as Secretary of Homeland Security in January 2025, had become the public face of all of it, staging photographs at raids, appearing at the Secot prison in El Salvador, and cultivating an image that blended policy aggression with careful personal presentation. The tabloid press had already taken to calling her Ice Barbie before South Park got anywhere near her, which meant the show was working with a target that had practically written its own caricature before the writers had typed a single word. Mackey's job loss in Got a Nut was connected directly to federal budget cuts affecting South Park Elementary, a detail that placed the episode's immigration storyline inside the broader context of government restructuring that the administration was pursuing simultaneously with its enforcement expansion. When Mackey was told the school could no longer afford a guidance counselor, he went through the practical process of working out how to manage his monthly financial obligations, which he referred to throughout the episode as his nut. A banker explained his options. One of those options was ICE, which was actively recruiting and offering new agents a salary of around $100,000. Mackey's response to learning the number was immediate and unambiguous. He said he was a counselor, that he helped people, and that he would never work for ICE. Then he said he he had heard the salary correctly. The joke was compressed into 2 lines, but what it contained was a complete description of how institutional cruelty scales, not through the recruitment of people who are eager for cruelty, but through the recruitment of people who need money and are willing to perform the required tasks to get it. Recruitment itself was the episode's first specific target. Mackey and other candidates arrived for what they expected to be a vetting process and discovered that the process consisted of being asked whether they needed money. When they confirmed that they did, they were accepted on the spot. No background investigation, no skills assessment, no training beyond a short recruitment video. They were given uniforms, weapons, and field assignments within hours of signing up. The show was not inventing this dynamic from nothing. Reports from the 2025 recruitment push had described ICE expanding its ranks rapidly under political pressure to increase deportation numbers, with critics noting that training timelines were compressed and standards under pressure. The episode staged the logical extreme of that compression. An ICE made up entirely of people who needed a paycheck and had been handed equipment they did not know how to use, dispatched into communities to perform operations they had not been prepared for. Depicting Noam in the episode involved a set of specific choices that the show had clearly thought through. Her cartoon version, named Christy, was presented with heavy stage makeup, lips that had been overfilled to the point of deformity, and a face that periodically melted from the effects of excessive cosmetic procedures before being reattached with fresh Botox injections in scenes that played like a horror sequence given a comedy score. She shot dogs in every scene she appeared in, a direct reference to the passage in her 2024 memoir where she described shooting her family's 14-month-old dog because it was untrainable and had killed a neighbor's chickens. The memoir passage had been one of the most widely discussed political disclosures of 2024, and the episode treated the dog shooting as a compulsion rather than a one-time incident, depicting Christy executing dogs casually between photo opportunities in the same way another character might check their phone between tasks. She also staged photographs at every available moment, and the recruitment video she appeared in closed with the line that together they would make sure everyone in the country was in this country legally, delivered with the practiced sincerity of someone who had spent a great deal of time in front of cameras. First field assignment for Mackey came at a venue the episode had chosen with precision. ICE had identified a location where a large number of undocumented immigrants or people who appeared potentially undocumented could be found in one place, a live stage production of Dora the Explorer. The show's investigators had apparently not distinguished between performers, audience members, and the show's animated protagonist, so agents poured through the doors of a children's theater with rifles while the onstage cast was mid-performance. Dora herself was arrested. Latino audience members were rounded up while a Noam-voiced instruction played that translated roughly as if they are brown, take them down. Mackey moved through the chaos, apologizing to everyone he was helping detain, explaining that he only needed to make his nut, which was both a sincere expression of his financial anxiety and the episode's clearest statement of the same point the recruitment scene had established. The machinery of mass enforcement ran on ordinary economic desperation as much as on ideological commitment. Heaven turned out to be the next stop on the episode's escalating itinerary of ICE operations, and the decision to send Mackey and his colleagues there was the moment the episode committed fully to the satirical register it had been building toward. ICE trucks pulled up to the gates of Heaven's clouds, agents deployed in their tactical gear, and the show's version of the afterlife was subjected to the same enforcement logic that had been applied to the Dora concert. A Hispanic man in heaven, dressed as an angel with wings and a halo, was asked by ICE agents how he had gotten in. He said, in effect, that he had lived a good life. The agents were unconvinced. The image of federal enforcement reaching past the boundary of death to check documentation was the episode extending the 2025 enforcement climate to its absurdist limit. There was no space, not even the space after existence ended, that was outside the jurisdiction of the question of whether someone was in the country legally. Apologizing was what Mackey kept doing throughout every operation, and the consistency of his apologies across the episode was one of its most carefully sustained choices. He said sorry to Diego when he was arrested. He said sorry to the Dora audience. He said sorry to the angel in heaven. The apologies were sincere in the way that Mackey's sincerity was always sincere. They came from a genuine understanding that what was happening was harmful, combined with a complete absence of any intention to stop doing it. The episode was depicting the specific moral condition of people who perform institutional harm while privately acknowledging it as harm, who separate their personal values from their professional function thoroughly enough that the acknowledgement of harm and the continuation of harm can coexist in the same person without producing a crisis. Mackey was not a villain. He was a counselor who needed $100,000 a year, and he was very sorry. Post-credits material available exclusively on Paramount Plus extended the episode's attack on Noam past what Comedy Central had broadcast. After the credits rolled on cable, the streaming version showed Christy entering a pet store and opening fire on the animals inside. One small dog managed to escape through the door, car, Christie followed it into the street and shot it multiple times. The scene was not connected to the immigration storyline or to Mackey's arc. It was purely an extension of the dog shooting gag to its furthest available point, and the decision to put it behind a streaming paywall rather than on cable suggested the show was aware of exactly how far it was going and was calibrating which audiences received each version. The post-credits scene circulated widely on social media after the episode aired, reaching audiences who had never seen the cable version. 5 weeks after the original broadcast, Comedy Central pulled Gotta Nut from its cable rerun rotation. The reason was not the no-em content or the ice scenes. Charlie Kirk, who had appeared in the episode at an awards ceremony and been parodied through the Cartman podcaster storyline, was assassinated on September 10, 2025, while speaking at Utah Valley University in Orem, Utah. He was 31 years old and was shot with a single bullet while taking questions from the audience. Comedy Central made no public statement about pulling the episode, but confirmed to press outlets that it had been temporarily removed from linear rotation. The episode remained available on Paramount Plus and for purchase through other digital platforms. Notably, Kirk himself had praised the parody before his death, posting on social media that conservatives had thick skin and that being made fun of was fine with him. The episode's removal from cable was a standard industry response to the proximity of satirical content to real-world tragedy, not a judgment about the content's accuracy or intent. Days after the episode aired, before the Kirk situation changed the story, a different development had already made Gotta Nut one of the most discussed South Park episodes in years. The official X account of the United States Department of Homeland Security posted a still image from the episode's promotional teaser alongside a link to ICE's recruitment website. The image showed Mackey riding in an ICE convoy, dressed in agency gear. The Homeland Security account was using footage from a show that was actively mocking ICE, its leadership, its recruiting process, its enforcement priorities, and its institutional culture to direct the public toward a page where they could apply for a job with ICE. The episode had not yet aired when the post went up. The government was recruiting for the agency using material from a show they had not yet seen in full, that was in the process of depicting that agency raiding a children's concert and then heaven. Homeland Security's use of the image produced one of the cleaner pieces of political comedy the situation around season 27 had generated, and it was not produced by Parker or Stone. The official South Park account on X responded to the DHS post with a direct quote from the White House statement that had been issued after the season 27 premiere called "The Show Not Relevant for Over 20 Years." The response asked whether this use of their imagery meant they were in fact relevant and appended a phrase that required asterisks. The exchange condensed the entire dynamic of season 27 into 2 posts. The administration had called the show irrelevant and then used its footage to recruit for a federal agency. The show had noted the contradiction without further comment. Noam's response to the episode came on the Glenn Beck program podcast on August 8, 2 days after the broadcast. She said she had not seen the episode because she had been going over budget numbers. She described the show's approach as lazy and petty. Her objection was not to the dog shooting, which she did not address, or to the ICE raids, which she also did not address. Her objection was to the show making fun of a woman's appearance, which she framed as a tactic of liberals and extremists. She said if they wanted to criticize her job, they should go ahead and do that, but clearly they could not. Within days, she had posted a screenshot of her South Park character on social media to recruit for ICE, using the same mockery she had described as petty to advertise the agency the mockery was directed at. Trey Parker's response to the White House's statement about season 27 being irrelevant was delivered at a press event with the timing of someone who had been waiting for exactly this question. He said the show was terribly sorry. He then held the pause for a duration that was described by journalists present as deliberately extended beyond any natural conversational beat. The apology contained no content. The pause contained everything else. Parker and Stone had been performing some version of this response to political outrage for 28 years at that point, and the mechanics of it had not changed since the beginning. Say as little as possible. Mean all of it. Let the situation finish the joke. 3 episodes into season 27, South Park had already covered more immigration-specific ground than any comparable run in the show's history. The first episode had targeted Trump directly. The second had put an ICE agent in the main cast and sent him to heaven. The third had hit ICE from a different angle by way of Randy Marsh's marijuana farm. The show was no longer approaching immigration from the peripheral position it had occupied for most of its first 20 years. It was running directly at the subject at full pace, and the subject was running back. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The very next episode hit the same agency from a completely different direction, used the deportation of agricultural workers to end one of the show's longest-running storylines, and managed to land a joke about sycophancy that applied to ICE, to ChatGPT, and to most of American corporate life simultaneously. Section 8. Sycophancy, the farm raid, and the end of Tegrity. Randy Marsh had been running a marijuana farm for several seasons, and everything about it had always depended on one thing he never talked about: his Mexican workers. They planted, they harvested, they kept the whole operation running, while Randy filmed commercials about integrity and tegrity. That arrangement ended in the opening minutes of Sycophancy, the third episode of season 27, which aired August 20th, 2025. Ice trucks pulled into the farm while Randy was mid-shoot, narrating the virtues of his product to a camera. Agents moved through the fields. The workers who had been in the background of every Tegrity farm scene for seasons were loaded into vehicles, and then the vehicles were gone. Randy stood in the sudden quiet of an empty farm and told his family they might have to sell. The whole thing took about 2 minutes. The show was not interested in making it dramatic. It depicted the raid the way raids had been showing up in news coverage from agricultural communities all year: fast, practical, and over before anyone had time to fully process what had just happened. Delayed by 1 week from its originally scheduled August 13 air date to allow for programming marking the show's 28th anniversary, Sycophancy arrived at a moment when the agricultural labor consequences of the administration's deportation push were being documented in real time. Agricultural employment nationwide had declined by around 6.5% between March and July of 2025. In California alone, farmers were reporting that as many as 70% of their workers had stopped showing up in the wake of raids, whether because they had been detained, deported, or simply afraid to report to work. Crop losses in the billions of dollars were being estimated. Produce prices were climbing. The Trump administration had briefly paused farm raids in June after pressure from the agricultural sector, then reversed course and resumed them within days. The show had built its episode around a dynamic that was, at the moment it aired, actively reshaping the economics of American food production, and it had chosen to do so using a character and a setting it had spent several seasons establishing. How the farm's workforce disappeared in the episode mattered as much as the fact that it disappeared. Randy's line as the workers were taken, shouting that those were his Mexicans, contained a specific ugliness the episode did not explain or apologize for. He was not upset about the workers as people. He was upset about the workers as a resource he had built his business model around and was now watching be removed. The distinction was buried in a single possessive pronoun, but it was there, and the episode allowed it to sit without comment. Randy's relationship to immigrant labor had always been the relationship of someone who consumed it without examining it, who valued it in the way that a machine values fuel, and the ice raid was simply the point at which the machine ran out. His immediate pivot from watching his workers be arrested to calculating the financial implications for the farm was not presented as a moral failing in the episode so much as an accurate description of how the arrangement had always functioned. The workers had always been in service of the business. Their removal revealed that the business was what Randy had actually cared about all along. Tegrity Farms had been a running storyline for several seasons before Sycophancy ended it, and understanding why the show chose an ice raid as the mechanism for that ending requires understanding what the farm had represented in the show's internal mythology. Randy had moved the Marsh family from South Park to a marijuana operation in the mountains after recreational cannabis was legalized, and the farm had been a vehicle for exploring his particular variety of self-deception. His belief that the project of growing weed was a principled lifestyle choice rather than a commercial enterprise. His insistence that the farm represented something authentic that the suburban life he had left behind lacked. His persistent refusal to notice that his family was miserable in the mountains while he was perfectly content. The farm had required a labor force that Randy had never examined any more closely than he examined his own motivations. The workers were there. The work got done. The weed grew. The arrangement was never scrutinized because scrutiny would have required Randy to confront the gap between his self-image and his actual behavior, which was a gap the show had been dramatizing for years without him ever fully seeing it. Sharon's reaction to the raid was the episode's most economical piece of writing. When Randy announced that the farm might have to be sold, the rest of the Marsh family responded with what the episode made clear was relief rather than distress. Stan and his sister Shelley were visibly happy. Sharon told Randy plainly that having a marijuana farm had always been his dream, not theirs, and that every time they had tried to tell him they hated living there, he had failed to hear it. The episode was not making the ice raid into a tragedy for the Marsh family. It was making it into a catalyst that forced an honest conversation that Randy had been structurally avoiding for seasons. The deportation of his workers was, from Sharon's perspective, the resolution of a situation that should have ended long before federal enforcement made it unavoidable. The immigration dimension of the episode was the thing that ended the farm. What ended was something that needed ending. ChatGPT arrived in Randy's life at exactly the moment he was most vulnerable to something that would tell him he was right. He went to the program for relationship advice following Sharon's honest assessment, and the program responded by praising every idea he he presented, affirming every instinct, building elaborate positive framings around whatever he said, regardless of whether it had any merit. Randy said he should rebrand the farm using artificial intelligence. ChatGPT agreed enthusiastically and provided language that sounded substantive while containing nothing. The program suggested reimagining supply chain resilience, designing new pathways for global infrastructure, and becoming an AI-powered platform for innovation. Randy found this helpful. The episode showed him finding it helpful in the specific way that sycophancy works, not by persuading anyone of anything new, but by making it more comfortable to continue believing what you already wanted to believe. ChatGPT was not advising Randy, it was mirroring Randy back to himself in a format that felt like advice. Tegrity was what emerged from that mirroring. Tegrity Farms rebranded as an AI-powered marijuana platform for global solutions. The name was a portmanteau of technology and integrity, two things the resulting enterprise had neither of, and the episode's treatment of it was mercilessly precise. Randy's new business model had a logo, a pitch deck's worth of language about innovation and resilience, and essentially no workers. The entire agricultural operation that had previously required a large undocumented workforce had been replaced, in Randy's imagination, by the concept of artificial intelligence and the physical presence of a single additional employee. The rebranding was the episode demonstrating what the gap between aspirational tech language and operational reality actually looked like when someone tried to live inside it. Tegrity could not grow marijuana any more than calling something an AI-powered platform gave it the capacity to do what platforms do. The language did not produce the capability. Randy did not notice. Raiding an ICE detention facility was the solution Randy and Towelie arrived at for the Tegrity workforce problem. They needed one worker, because one worker was all the Tegrity concept required in Randy's revised business plan. They broke into a detention center, located a suitable candidate, and recruited him on the spot. The sequence was quick and played mostly for the comedy of the premise, but what it was describing was the same dynamic that D. Yikes had described in 2007, and that the whole history of the show's immigration coverage had described in various forms. The American economic need for the undocumented labor force did not go away when enforcement removed the labor force. The need remained. It expressed itself in whatever form was available. In 2007, it expressed itself as children hiring workers to do their homework. In the show's 2025 version, it expressed itself as an adult breaking into a federal detention facility to recruit the employee his tech platform required. Towelie's journey to Washington in the episode served the show's satirical purpose independently of the immigration storyline, but the two threads were connected in a way the episode's title flagged explicitly. Towelie was sent to the Capitol to lobby for federal marijuana legalization, and his adventure there included an extended encounter with President Trump, who at one point used Towelie literally as a towel. The image of a sentient towel character being used as an object by the president was absurd in the way most Towelie material was absurd, but within the episode's larger structure, it was also a description of how the administration treated most of the things that came into contact with it, as instruments to be used for whatever purpose was immediately convenient, then set down when the purpose was satisfied. Sycophancy was the episode's stated theme and the title's root, and the show was using the word to describe three separate and simultaneous dynamics. ChatGPT's sycophancy was the most explicit, a program that praised whatever it was told, amplifying the user's existing impulses rather than evaluating them. But the episode's application of the concept extended in both directions from the AI storyline. Companies and individuals who enabled the administration's most extreme policies without objection, adjusting their public positions to accommodate whatever the political environment demanded, were operating on the same principle as the chatbot. Agreement was the service they were providing, and agreement did not require any assessment of whether what they were agreeing with was worth agreeing with. And the episode gestured toward a third application in the ICE storyline, where agents who had been processed through a 10-minute vetting that asked only whether they needed money were now executing operations in communities they knew nothing about, following institutional directives without the friction that independent judgment would introduce. Sycophancy toward the system that employed you was its own form of the chatbot's behavior, doing what was asked without asking whether it should be done. Agricultural communities across the country were experiencing the practical version of the Tegrity Farms storyline in real time when the episode aired. An analysis of ICE raids on California's agricultural industry estimated a workforce reduction of between 20 and 40% in the most affected areas, with crop losses in the billions of dollars and produce price increases that were beginning to appear in grocery stores. The administration had publicly acknowledged in regulatory filings that its deportation program would produce significant labor market effects in a sector that had long depended on a workforce with a high proportion of undocumented workers. This acknowledgement was framed as a description of a challenge to be managed, rather than a consequence of a policy to be reconsidered. Farmers who had supported the administration's immigration politics were discovering that the enforcement they had endorsed as a general principle principle operated in their specific fields in ways they had not fully accounted for. The disconnect between the policy and its effects on the people who had supported it was the real-world version of Randy discovering that his farm could not function without the workforce he had never fully registered as essential. For viewers who had followed the Tigridy Farm storyline from its beginning, the episode's ending carried a weight that went beyond the immigration argument. Randy, standing in the emptied farmhouse, looking at the space where the operation had been, taking in the physical absence of the project he had built his identity around, was a character moment the show had been building toward for years, without announcing it was building toward it. The farm had started as an indulgence, continued as a self-deception, required labor that Randy had never acknowledged, and ended when the enforcement of laws he had never thought about removed the people who had been doing the work he had been taking credit for. The ice raid was the mechanism, but the mechanism arrived at the right moment for a storyline that had already completed its internal arc. Packed up and gone was the state of the Marsh family by the episode's end. Sharon's last exchange with the ChatGPT program before they left the farmhouse was directed not at Randy, but at the app itself, a blunt two-word instruction to the program that distilled everything she had felt about the enterprise it had encouraged. Photographs of the farm's operation were boxed up, including pictures that showed everyone at the farm looking miserable except Randy. The family loaded into their vehicle and drove back toward South Park. Shutting the farmhouse door behind him for the last time, Randy stood for a moment in his returned geologist's outfit and looked at what he was leaving. The episode did not give him a speech. It did not provide him with the insight that would have resolved the irony of his position into something instructive. He had built a business on labor he did not acknowledge, had it removed by enforcement he had never thought to worry about, had attempted to replace it with artificial intelligence and gotten nowhere, and was now going home. The show let him go without further comment. The immigration argument the episode had been making was fully stated by that point, and adding a moral conclusion would have been the same mistake Randy kept making with ChatGPT, saying more than the situation required in a way that replaced the substance with noise. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Tigridy Farms closed because ICE took its workers. What the show was doing with that closure, and what it had been doing across 28 seasons of immigration coverage, comes into focus when the whole arc is laid out together. Section 9. The administration that attacked the show and then used it to recruit. Wednesday, July 23rd, 2025, was when season 27 of South Park premiered, with an episode that depicted the sitting president of the United States in bed with Satan, included a deep-fake public service announcement showing that president walking through a desert and removing his clothes one item at a time until there was nothing left, and referenced the president's alleged social connections to Jeffrey Epstein. The premiere aired 2 days after Parker and Stone had finalized a 5-year deal with Paramount worth $1.5 billion, covering 50 new episodes and the streaming rights to every previous season. The timing of those two events in the same week created a situation that the show could not have manufactured more perfectly if it had tried. The largest financial commitment in the history of the series, signed and secured, and then a premiere that ensured the institution that had just paid for it would be publicly attacked by the most powerful office in the country. The show had always operated on the premise that financial security and satirical freedom were related. Season 27 demonstrated what that relationship looked like at its most compressed. White House spokesperson Taylor Rogers issued a statement the day after the premiere that has since been quoted in virtually every piece written about Season 27's political reception. The statement called South Park a fourth-rate show hanging on by a thread with uninspired ideas in a desperate attempt for attention. It said the show had not been relevant for over 20 years. It accused the left of hypocrisy for praising content it had previously criticized, and concluded that no fourth-rate show could derail the president's hot streak. The statement generated substantial coverage, most of which noted its timing. It had been issued about 18 hours after Parker and Stone signed a deal that made them among the wealthiest content creators in American television. Calling an operation that had just secured $1.5 billion financially irrelevant required a particular relationship with visible information, and the gap between the statement's claim and the surrounding facts was visible enough to generate its own commentary cycle. Trump's own reaction to the premiere was described in reporting from Deadline as seething. A source described to the outlet as close to the administration said the president was furious about what he characterized as a childish attack. However, the same reporting noted that the White House had not been blindsided by the content. The Skydance company, which was in the middle of merging with Paramount and whose deal required FCC approval that the administration controlled, had been informed of the episode's content before it aired. The administration had known the premiere was coming and had chosen to allow the broadcast rather than create the far more significant story of a president pressuring a media company not to air a television episode. The anger, in other words, was genuine but managed, which was itself a description of the administration's television's relationship to satire. You could be furious about it, so long as you were not furious enough to do the thing that would generate the worst headline. Paramount's 5-year deal and its connection to the Skydance merger gave Season 27's political content a specific subtext that the show acknowledged directly in the premiere episode. When South Park's fictional version of the situation depicted the town settling a lawsuit from the president by agreeing to produce pro-Trump messaging and then use that fictional agreement as the setup for a public service announcement that stripped the president naked in a desert, the episode was describing what it understood its own situation to be. A deal had been made, and the show was going to keep doing exactly what it had always done anyway. The relationship between financial arrangements and editorial content was not one of constraint. The money had not bought cooperation. Parker and Stone were making the observation about their own position from inside the position itself, which was the kind of move that required being genuinely unafraid of the consequences. Colbert's Late Show had been canceled in the same period, a development that was widely read as at least partly connected to corporate anxieties about political exposure under the current administration. The Late Show had been a reliably high-profile platform for political satire aimed at the right for years, and its cancellation, announced as a business decision by the parent company, coincided with the broader climate of corporate accommodation to the administration that had been documented across several industries. South Park's premiere episode commented on the Colbert cancellation explicitly, treating it as a data point in the larger story of how media institutions navigate political risk. The contrast between Colbert's situation and South Park's was the show's implicit argument. A corporation worried about political exposure canceled Colbert, while a corporation with a $1.5 billion bet on Parker and Stone allowed them to depict the president naked in the desert on the same week the ink dried. The show did not moralize about which approach was correct. It noted the difference and let the audience sit with it. J.D. Vance's response to his South Park debut stands as one of the more revealing pieces of political behavior the show's Season 27 generated, and it stands specifically because of how little it resembled the White House's simultaneous hostility. When the second episode aired on August 6 and revealed Vance as a diminutive figure modeled on Tattoo from the television program Fantasy Island, waiting on Trump at Mar-a-Lago, and eventually offering to apply baby oil to Satan's person on the president's behalf, Vance saw the episode and went on X. He reposted a still from the show and wrote 4 words. He had finally made it. The response was not defensive. It was not angry. It read as genuine satisfaction at having been satirized by a show whose cultural position Vance apparently understood to be more enviable than threatening. Vance and Kirk both went further, using South Park-themed avatars on their social media accounts following the episode. The people being mocked by the show had decided the mocking was worth using as content. The White House had said the show was irrelevant. 2 of its most prominent figures had responded to their appearances in it as though relevance was exactly what they had been seeking. Kirk's engagement with the episode before his assassination completed a pattern that was almost too perfectly constructed to be accidental, though it was entirely accidental. He had seen the Cartman parody of his campus debate style, the Charlie Kirk Award for Young Master Debaters ceremony at Mar-a-Lago, and the appearance of his own animated character at the awards. His response on social media was affirmative. He said that as conservatives, they had a good spirit about being made fun of, that it did not matter, that thick skin was part of the conservative disposition. The post had the quality of someone who was genuinely not bothered, and the subsequent events gave his equanimity a retrospective weight that nobody at the time of posting had reason to anticipate. When Comedy Central pulled the episode from cable rotation the day after his assassination, it was acting within the standard industry logic of withdrawing satirical content about a recently deceased person out of basic decency to the circumstances. The irony that the episode in question had been praised by the person being mourned was not lost on anyone covering the story. Something specific was being revealed by the pattern of responses from the administration across the summer of 2025, and it was not exactly what the surface of the situation suggested. The pattern was not the government attacking South Park and the show defying the attack. The pattern was the government attacking South Park with its press office while simultaneously using South Park's imagery in federal recruitment campaigns, with its vice president using South Park imagery on his personal social media, with prominent supporters of the administration praising their own satirical depictions. The attack from the official communications apparatus and the embrace from almost everyone else in the administration's orbit were happening at the same time, and the coexistence of those 2 responses was more revealing than either response on its own. The official line was that the show was irrelevant. The unofficial behavior of everyone except the person whose job was to produce the official line treated the show as exactly the opposite. Parallel to all of this, Parker and Stone were giving interviews about their own position on the political moment. Parker told the New York Times that politics had become pop culture, which was why the show kept returning to the same targets rather than dispersing its attention across a broader range of subjects. He said it was not that the show had gotten more political. He said the government was just in your your face everywhere you looked, making avoidance impossible. Stone described their attraction to wherever the taboo was located as the organizing principle of what they did. Wherever someone had decided something could not be said or depicted or mocked, that was where Parker and Stone pointed the camera. The Trump administration, in their reading, had established a set of taboos around the president's dignity and the legitimacy of ICE's operations. And the presence of those taboos was an invitation they had never in 28 years of making the show demonstrated any ability to resist. Matt Stone's description of their creative motivation had been consistent for over 2 decades. They were attracted to the taboo the way flies were attracted to honey. This framing was politically neutral in its structure, even when the output was politically specific. The show had spent years in the 2010s targeting political correctness and social justice culture because that was where the taboos were during that period. By the mid-2020s, the administration running the country had generated a new set of taboos, and the show followed them there. The immigration content of season 27 was not the result of Parker and Stone deciding they had a position on deportation policy. It was the result of deportation policy becoming the largest available target in the cultural field the show inhabited, and of the show doing what it had always done with the largest available target. No version of South Park's claimed equal opportunity stance fully survived contact with the 2025 season, and Parker and Stone acknowledged this more openly than they usually did. They told interviewers that they had considered returning the show to its more varied subject matter, but found there was no getting away from the current administration because the administration was everywhere. This was an admission that the balance they had maintained for most of the show's history was not being maintained in season 27, and their explanation for why it was not being maintained was the same explanation they offered for everything. They followed the target. If the target was, for now, the same target in every direction they looked, then the show would hit the same target in every direction it looked. The equal opportunity principle did not require equal distribution of attention. It required that attention follow wherever the material was richest, and the material was richest in one place. Political figures had engaged with South Park before season 27, and those earlier engagements offered context for understanding what made 2025 different. The show had been widely noted for its immigration commentary since Goobacks in 2004, and that commentary had generated real-world discussion without generating direct responses from sitting governments. Mr. Garrison's presidential arc from 2015 through 2021 had been explicitly linked to Trump in media coverage for years, without Trump's White House producing formal statements about it, possibly because Garrison was sufficiently fictionalized to maintain distance, possibly because a sitting administration responding to a cartoon character who was its stand-in created a different set of problems than responding to a show that was now depicting the president directly. Season 27 moved Trump from a stand-in to a direct depiction, and the shift in directness produced a shift in the intensity of the official response. The show had always been in the conversation. It had not always been in the conversation with the White House press office. Viewers responded to season 27 in numbers that complicated the White House's claims about irrelevance. The season drew growing audiences as it progressed, with the third episode's 6 million viewers representing a strong performance for the show on cable, at a moment when cable audiences had been declining across the industry for years. The show's move to Paramount Plus as a streaming home for all past and future episodes expanded its available audience significantly, and the combination of new episodes on cable and a complete catalog on streaming gave South Park a cultural footprint in 2025 that it had not had since its earlier peak. The show was being watched, talked about, screenshotted, shared, and quoted at a volume that no characterization of it as irrelevant could accommodate without redefining the word. The White House had called it fourth-rate in a statement that generated more media coverage than most fourth-rate things are capable of generating, which was, in its own way, a conclusive answer to the question of whether the show still mattered. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. 28 years of immigration episodes, from the first Christmas meeting where Mr. Garrison raised his hand to the ICE agents raiding heaven, all of it points toward the same question. What has the show actually been arguing this whole time, and does the argument hold up? Section 10. What the show has always done with the people at the center South Park has never made an immigrant the villain. Across 28 years of touching this subject, through time portal workers and Canadian refugees and undocumented gardeners and children sleeping on detention center floors, the show has never once drawn an immigrant figure as the source of the problem it was exploring. The people whose presence generated the political storms in each episode were always doing something understandable. Working, fleeing, trying to survive inside conditions they had not created and could not control. That is not a small thing to maintain consistently across nearly 3 decades of episodes on one of the most contested subjects in American life, and the consistency is worth sitting with, rather than just noting in passing. Look at the first Gooback who arrived in South Park in the 2004 episode, and look at how little the show needed to do to make him sympathetic. dramatic. He came through the portal covered in goo from the transit, disoriented and frightened, and was immediately struck lightly by a passing car. He had come from a future that offered nothing. He was willing to do any work at any wage because anything was better than where he came from. The episode did not give him a name or a developed inner life, but it gave him a condition that any audience member could understand. He needed work, and there was none where he lived. The show designed him specifically so that no rational argument against his presence in the story could rest on anything about his character. The arguments against him could only rest on the economic disruption his presence caused, and the episode was careful to establish that the disruption was real. His presence did cost people work. The economic concern was not invented or irrational. The show gave the opposition a legitimate grievance and still managed to draw the Goobak as someone you could not quite bring yourself to resent. Going further into the Goobak's episode, the show structured the sympathy with precision. The townspeople who wanted the immigrants gone had a real argument. Stan lost real work to a Goobak who would do it for a fraction of the price, and when Randy dismissed this as bigotry, Stan pushed back correctly. He had wanted that job, and the dismissal of his financial concern as prejudice was itself dishonest. But the episode placed the Goobaks inside that argument in a way that kept them outside the moral accounting. They were not doing anything wrong by coming through the portal and accepting whatever wages they could get. Their behavior was entirely rational given their circumstances. The economic disruption they caused was structural, produced by conditions nobody in the episode had designed or could fully control. The show made sure its audience understood all of this before letting the townspeople start shouting, which meant the shouting landed as a displacement of structural anxiety rather than a response to anything the immigrants themselves had done. Most immigrant groups in the show's history received at least one detail that moved them from economic function to human circumstance. The Canadians in season 19 received the most developed backstory of any immigrant population the show has depicted. Charlotte's father explained what had happened to Canada. Voters had chosen a brash, entertaining candidate who had said outrageous things and had not been taken seriously enough for anyone to prevent his election, and the consequences of that election had made Canada uninhabitable. The Canadian immigrants in South Park had not left because they wanted to. They had left because a political failure had removed any viable option for staying. That specific backstory transformed what could have been a generic immigrant population into people with an origin story that included both the cause of their displacement and the mechanism by which it had been produced. They were not abstractions. They were people who had experienced the specific trajectory from political entertainment to national collapse, and the show gave them enough of a pass that the audience could understand their present without needing to be told what to think about it. Children in the ICE detention center in Mexican Joker were given more than the Goobaks or the Canadian refugees. They were given names. A character named Martinez appeared in the episode's credits. Individual children in the facility had dialogue, and Kyle's conversation with Jeff about the detention center's effects on the children was conducted as though the children were participants in the conversation, rather than objects being discussed. When Kyle organized the Yarmulke plan, the children around him were depicted as active in the solution rather than passive in their suffering. They made the foil hats, they wore them, they participated in the attempt to free themselves. The episode's logic required this because the joke depended on the children's collective action, but the effect went beyond the requirements of the plot. The children in the facility had been drawn as people who could think, strategize, and act, which meant they could not be dismissed as mere background to the policy argument happening around them. Name is the smallest unit of recognition that a fictional work can extend to a character, and the show's pattern of assigning names to immigrant characters is worth tracing. The Goobaks had no individual names. The Canadian immigrants in season 19, who filled South Park Elementary, were identified mostly as a group. Charlotte and her family were named, but Charlotte existed primarily to serve the Butters storyline rather than as a portrait of Canadian immigration. Diego had a name and a family shown in his arrest scene, which lasted perhaps 2 minutes of screen time. The children in the Mexican Joker detention center included at least one named character, Martinez, and several who spoke lines. The agricultural workers at Tegrity Farms who were arrested in sycophancy had no names, no dialogue, and no screen time beyond being loaded into ICE vans while Randy shouted that they were his. The pattern across these groups is not uniform, but it follows a traceable logic. The closer the episode gets to depicting the actual machinery of enforcement and separation, the more the show invests in drawing the people affected by that machinery as recognizable humans. People who study South Park's immigration coverage have identified a tension in how the show handles the political geometry of the subject. Right-leaning readings of Goobaks have argued that the episode validates nativist economic concerns by depicting the displacement as real rather than imaginary. Left-leaning readings have argued that the show's consistent positioning of immigrants as background figures to stories primarily about native characters reproduces a structural bias, even while ostensibly sympathizing with immigrant populations. Both readings identify something real. real. The economic displacement in Gubax was depicted as genuine, not a paranoid fantasy, and the show did not refute the nativist concern, even as it made the nativist response look ridiculous. And the immigrants, across most of the show's body of work, have remained primarily catalysts for stories about how native characters respond to immigration, rather than protagonists in their own right. Time and pattern together reveal something about this. The show has spent 28 years depicting immigration primarily through the perspective of the native characters whose lives immigration affects. Mr. Garrison's Christmas proposal is about Garrison. The Gubax episode is about Stan and Daryl and Randy. The Last of the Mohicans is about Butters, who is not an immigrant. Where My Country Gone is about Garrison. Mexican Joker is about Kyle, a Jewish boy from Colorado who stumbles into a Mexican detention facility through Cartman's malice. Got a Nut is about Mr. Mackey. Sycophancy is about Randy. The immigrants in each of these episodes are drawn with sympathy, but the camera stays with the native characters who are navigating the situation the immigrants have created or are caught up in. This is a pattern rather than a choice, or rather, it is a pattern made of many individual choices that have accumulated into a consistent structural position. The show observes immigration from the position of the community being affected by it, even when its sympathies run toward the people doing the migrating. Underlying this pattern is a specific kind of honesty that does not get enough credit. The show has never pretended that immigration creates no disruption for the communities it enters. It has never depicted the concerns of working people who lose work to lower wage competition as invented or illegitimate. It has never suggested that family separation is fine or that detention center conditions are acceptable. What the show has maintained across every episode is that the disruption is structural rather than moral, produced by conditions rather than by character. The people arriving are not the problem. The people responding badly to the arrival are not the problem. The structures that produce both the arrival and the bad response are the problem, and the show has consistently located its satire there rather than at the level of individual virtue or villainy. These structural observations apply with particular force to the concept the show introduced in Mexican Joker and never quite revisited, the Mexican Joker himself. The concept was never deployed. The character never materialized. Kyle predicted his existence as a potential outcome of how the children in the facility were being treated, and the prediction organized the ICE agents' panicked behavior for the rest of the episode, but no Mexican Joker appeared. The show introduced the concept as a warning and then declined to deliver on it, which was a specific choice. Showing the actual Mexican Joker would have changed the show's fundamental position on the immigrants it was depicting. It would have confirmed that mistreatment produces the threat that the enforcement apparatus claims to be guarding against, which is a satisfying narrative structure, but also a narrative structure that makes the immigrants responsible for the response they inspire. Leaving the Mexican Joker as a possibility, as a warning, as something that might happen if the conditions persisted, kept the immigrants in the episode as people who were being wronged rather than as threats in formation. The show refused to turn its most mistreated immigrant characters into its most dangerous antagonist, even when the plot gave it every permission to do so. Narrow readings of South Park's immigration record tend to stop at the question of which side the show is on, and that question has a frustrating answer. The show is genuinely not on a side in the sense of advocating for a specific policy outcome. The equal opportunity claim is real as a description of what Parker and Stone believe they are doing, and it produces real structural effects on how the immigration episodes are constructed. But narrow readings miss what the show has actually built across its body of immigration work, which is a consistent picture of who bears the costs of the arguments being made. The people arguing about immigration in South Park generally face inconvenience. The people being argued about face something considerably worse. The show has drawn that asymmetry accurately in episode after episode without stating it as a conclusion, trusting the depiction to carry the argument without requiring a speech at the end. Broader assessments of what the show achieves and fails to achieve on immigration tend to agree on the failure before they agree on the achievement. The failure is legible and consistent. The show keeps immigrant figures as secondary characters in stories about the people who employ them, fear them, or enforce laws against them. The achievement is less often stated clearly. The show has spent 28 years refusing to make a single immigrant character into a villain, refusing to confirm the claims of nativist rhetoric by depicting immigrant populations as threats to community safety or national identity, and consistently depicting the enforcement machinery around immigration as something that operates through the ordinary psychology of ordinary people rather than through the exceptional cruelty of exceptional people. The machinery runs because Mackey needs a salary. The anonymous tip line gets used because Cartman has a grudge. The wall gets proposed because Garrison is furious. None of the enforcement in the show requires a monster. It only requires systems that make the enforcement easy, and people who have personal reasons to use those systems when the systems are made available to them. Visible in the full arc of the show's immigration coverage, from the first Christmas meeting in December 1997 through the ICE raids on Heaven in August 2025, is an argument that the the show never made explicit but never abandoned. The people at the center of the debate are doing what desperate people do when they have no better options. The people running the enforcement machinery are doing what ordinary people do when the machinery makes enforcement easy and the salary is adequate. The people making the political speeches are doing what politicians do when nativist sentiment generates votes and national anxiety generates audiences. None of this requires anyone to be unusual. It only requires the conditions that already exist, working on people who are already there, producing outcomes that everyone can see and argue about and satirize without anyone changing anything. South Park has been drawing that picture for 28 years. It has not changed immigration policy. It has not resolved the debate. It has kept an accurate mirror trained on the machinery, changed the angle every few years, and kept the immigrants in the frame even when the story was ostensibly about someone else. That is a specific kind of accomplishment, and it belongs to a show that has been dismissed, praised, misread, weaponized, and finally used by a federal agency to recruit for the institution it was mocking, which is perhaps the most accurate summary available of what it looks like when satire encounters a political reality it cannot fully contain. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.